Hey, welcome to another episode of the Inquisitive Mind of Lughes podcast, IMoLTPodcast. If you're watching this for the first time or the last time, either way, make sure you hit the subscribe and like or comment. If you're watching this on Instagram or Facebook, make sure you go to the YouTube to watch the full episode. This is just a clip. Anyway, thanks for coming back and watching us. We do have a guest coming back again. We have Lindsey Lughes. Lindsey, who are you?
I'm Lindsey Lughes. I'm the executive director of the LGBT Center of Raleigh.
Yep, and so we have her coming back. The episode we did before was talking about misconceptions of the T in LGBTQ and just different things, talking about transgender community. I think we opened up a lot of great dialogue with that. So we're kind of continuing that conversation, just still just kind of going over some of the basics. I know, but speaking of the last episode, Lindsey wanted to address some things real quick and kind of, I guess, prerequisite or just, I don't know.
Right. Well, after I watched our last episode, there was something I wish I would have said in that. So I wanted to start this episode by sharing that when I went back and watched it, I realized at no point did I acknowledge that as a cisgender, a person who does not identify as transgender, so I identify as a queer cisgender woman, meaning I do identify as the gender I was assigned at birth. I was speaking about transgender identities and I'm not transgender. So I wanted to be really clear that I have, a lot of professional training from like the Transgender Training Institute in Philadelphia, where I was trained by transgender people on how to speak to predominantly audiences of people who are not transgender about transgender identities. I also make sure that everything I speak to or speak about, I'm learning from transgender people, answering to transgender people. Even that last episode, I sent it to a number of my friends and loved ones who are transgender and said, give me feedback, tell me how I did.
I did the same thing.
Yeah. What do you wish I would have acknowledged or... and I think it's very important that I both use the platform that I'm able to have because I am cisgender, and there are people who are not transgender who will listen to me because I am not transgender, and they connect with me maybe differently or ask me questions they would be embarrassed to ask somebody who's transgender.
The same.
While
I feel the same way.
while also making sure that I'm always answering to and being accountable to people who are transgender.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, I tried to get feedback and questions from friends. It's kind of hard. I mean, I got a lot of positive feedback, but as far as questions, one person kind of asked me, and it's going to lead into one of the topics. Why when we were talking about Caitlin and Bruce, you corrected me and saying that I should never. I shouldn't say Bruce should not be a thing, and so, and then I just I guess I want to almost kind of answer this, but and that's kind of like a term called deadpanning,
dead naming.
Dead naming.
Yep.
Dead naming. So, do you want to explain what that is?
Sure. So dead naming is a pretty common term used by a lot of folks in the transgender community around their former name. So sometimes that's still their legal name, their birth name. And dead naming, I think, really explains exactly what that is. That is a name that we don't use anymore. So even as we just had this conversation again, and you dead named Caitlyn Jenner again, I immediately, I make a real point to, as soon as you can, forget that you ever even knew that name. Like, that name is dead to you. It is dead to that person. They have chosen a new name for a reason. Obviously, there are some certain situations where it's unavoidable, like if somebody has to fill out legal documentation and their name hasn't been legally changed. But as often as possible, I try to never learn somebody's dead name. But it's actually one of the most common things I think people do is they will tell me about somebody, and I'm going to use, this is absolutely not a real person, I'm going to use two names, but they'll say, my friend Jenny, so she used to be James, and they mean that in a really well-meaning way. They're just letting me know that, this is who she used to be. And every time I think to myself, like, you shouldn't have, that's not my business. I just need to know Jenny as Jenny. I don't need to know who Jenny was previously. Additionally, something that I probably should acknowledge too is another thing that people do, again, very well-meaning people. These are not people who are intentionally being, transphobic or saying harmful things, but they'll flip back to, so say we're talking about Jenny. If they want to reference Jenny when she was 5 years old and they knew her in the neighborhood, they'll say, well, back when Jenny was James, or they'll flip pronouns back. So they'll say, well, he was, she was a he then. And so it's one of the things that, we always move forward with the language of who we know a person to be. So even if you knew Jenny when Jenny may have been called James, Jenny was still Jenny then. We just didn't know that yet. And I think I said that in the last episode, and it's something that I really want to reiterate. So that's what a dead name is, but it's also why it's so important that we continue to move forward with who we know somebody to be. So when I refer to I have some transgender people in my life who I have known since childhood, and I just would never acknowledge that to anybody that I knew them then, and they are always who I know them to be now, even when I reference them then. So it's just
And I think that's one of the things that's I think the trans community would especially as this was a new thing, have to be kind of understanding on, because that's something and I'm saying understanding as people that don't know that, because recently Michael Shea from Saturday Night Live, like I watched that skit. He's getting a lot of heat because of dead naming. And I'm pretty sure before that he probably I never heard of what dead naming was. We talked about the whole thing. I never knew, because it's that's kind of it for us. That is hard. You know what I mean? It's I'm just saying, like, because you're talking about changing a point of time of something that you knew.
A lot of what we are discussing is hard. A lot of it is really challenging because it does challenge everything that we've known and the way we've looked at things. However, it is really important that as often as possible we do that. I think that most transgender people I know have been pretty understanding of knowing when somebody doesn't know, but they don't want to have to correct somebody again and again. As for the Saturday Night Live thing, when I watched that, the way I felt was maybe he didn't know that wasn't okay. I guess I don't know the process that happens around the way Saturday Night Live jokes are written, but I find it hard to believe that there wasn't somebody on set. This is common knowledge enough, and Caitlyn Jenner came out 5 or 6 years ago. So this has been common knowledge enough that we're not referring to her as who she used to be, that I think it's surprising that even if he himself didn't know, that nobody would have stepped in and said, hey, that's not appropriate, or that's not how we want to word this.
Yeah. And I mean, that's what I think people kind of get in one of the reasons of doing this, I think people get in their bubbles. So in your world, and the people you talk to, that's probably very commonly known.
Yeah.
But outside of that world, I'm just saying. I don't think it's so uncommon that somebody in New York City who works on SNL could not have caught that and said, hey, that's a problem. I think he knew it was a problem when he was telling it. I thought in his delivery, I thought in the audience reaction was very much like, ooh, you probably shouldn't have gone there. I mean, I think that was just kind of, and I mean, I only watched it once, I only heard a clip of it once.
Yeah, same here.
But, because that wasn't the punchline. Like that, I don't think, because when I first, I was like, ooh, he wasn't trying to make a joke or a plight of that.
Right.
Like the joke or the punchline was about Kanye, and it wasn't even about you know what I mean? So I don't know in SNL, I don't see them doing that on purpose. I mean, yes, maybe someone should have caught that, but obviously they didn't.
And I think
should they be, if he didn't mean any ill will towards it, he's educated and move on. Like, I don't understand. Like, do you think there needs to be, like I said, I said this on the last one, a lot of times, I don't know if I said it on show, but I know we've talked about it, like the alphabets can be bullies.
I really, really disagree with that, that LGBTQ people are bullies.
Okay.
I think that LGBTQ people we talked about it last time, and I'll reiterate, Black transgender women are victims of violence more often than any other person in
Oh,
America.
I'm not.
So, but I want to clarify that when I say that, when we're talking about things, I think across the board, I think people are demanding accountability now, like they never have before, and I think that extends beyond just LGBT identities. To back to that point about his joke, I do think that when I watched it, I mean, you even hear somebody in the audience say no. Like, I do think that people are coming to understand that Caitlyn Jenner should not be
refer to anything else.
And even part of a joke.
Yeah.
And you know what's funny about this, Lewis? I thought about this last night in preparation for coming to talk to you today. And I thought about the concept of punching down. It's something that we're kind of coming to understand in our society is like, what's funny, right? Punching up is always appropriate. So somebody who is less marginalized than you can make fun of. You can make jokes about. Somebody who is more marginalized than you or more likely to be a victim of violence or discrimination, et cetera, you can't. And I realized last night, you were the person who taught me that.
I was.
You were.
I remember that.
In like 2003. And I thought about how often, especially when it comes to this, we kind of, in the conversations we've had, you're often saying like, well, I don't see why this is a big deal to joke about. And so what I would say to you is,
and I'm not saying that this is not a big deal. I'm just saying, and I don't know Michael Shea. I'm just saying because we don't know. So I'm just saying if he was genuine, like, and didn't mean anything by it, and he took this as a learning experience, what do people get from bullying him?
Right.
Past that.
And I guess that probably goes to a larger topic that we could talk about of where we are kind of again as a society and call out culture and cancel culture and all of those things. Yeah. So there's probably a lot to that. But when it comes to LGBTQ people asking for or even demanding respect and what they need, how they need to be treated, I don't think that LGBT people are especially are unique in their desires to be treated well. And I think that LGBT people, particularly again particularly Black transgender women, but transgender people are so often marginalized. The whole world can be very challenging and very threatening. Mm-hmm. And so saying this is how I expect to be talked about, talked to, and treated, I don't think that's bullying. But I also think that, like I said, that's a larger conversation. But I think that we as a culture right now are having some big issues around cancel culture. Yeah. And maybe swinging the pendulum a little too far. Like maybe it's, we also want to stay in conversation with each other and have conversations about things that can be hard without saying the wrong thing and having somebody say, well, I'm done. I'm not speaking to you anymore. Or,
If you decide to come back and we do this again, I would like, and after you watch the latest Chappelle, I would think that the cancel culture would be a nice next part 3 topic.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
Let's get into part 2, or that's weird, but getting into now, one of the other like pressing conversations that's going on is kind of where do transgenders fit in sports? Because on one end, you have the U.S. powerlifting. They're banning trans women from competing as women.
Right.
Then you have a transgender male he has to compete as a woman and has been dominating that field. And so on both of those, you have people upset, I guess, so. As someone who is in this, like, and as I know you're a cis woman, but kind of a representative of the trans community, what do you feel like is the right answer? Like, what is on both ends? Like, what is right? Well, what do people want, and how what would be the correct way in your opinion?
Right, of course.
Moving forward towards on this.
Yeah. So I don't. I know what my personal feelings are around this as a cisgender woman in my cis opinion, but I think that largely what I think we're hearing is from folks who are transgender, and I think I'm correct in saying this, is people want to compete as who they are. They want to compete not as what they were assigned at birth, but as who they actually are. My own feelings about this are. My ultimate answer is people should be allowed to compete as who they are. And if we're having a conversation about advantages or disadvantages, physical advantages or disadvantages, I think we're overlooking the fact that a lot of people are great at certain sports because they have physical advantages, and we don't make them sit out because of it. You know, one of the things that I remember reading about or hearing about is like Michael Phelps, you know, maybe the best swimmer in the world, has a lung capacity, you know, twice the size of a lot of his peers. Just how he was born. Michael Phelps was born with huge lungs, which makes him a really, you know, he dominates in the sport of swimming because he's able to hold his breath so long underwater. So we can't say, oh, Michael Phelps, that's an unfair advantage. Your lung capacity needs to be exactly the same of all the other swimmers you compete with in order for us to let you swim in the same, you know, similarly with, you know, basketball players, somebody who's born who's 6'10". Of course they have an advantage, you know. But I think that so that's mostly what the conversation seems to circle around is, does somebody have an advantage because they went through puberty under the influence of testosterone? You know, does testosterone make people naturally better at sports? We know that there's probably some logic to, you know, testosterone or estrogen may affect center of gravity, may affect muscle mass. It's historically been said that people who are testosterone dominant have lower centers of gravity, and I think more upper body strength, whereas people with estrogen, you know, typically we think of that as being cisgender women, have more lower body strength, et cetera. But ultimately it kind of comes down to it's really one of those cases and situations where we have to look at how much gender does come into play. And what I think is funny is even what you mentioned, so they're often making transgender women not able to compete with other women because they're saying, no, you have an advantage because you went through, they typically say male puberty, but that's not the right way to say that. You went through puberty under the influence of testosterone. Mm-hmm. And then they're saying to transgender men, well, now you have to compete with women. Well, no, that's not fair because now you're, you know, it's just so complicated. It just feels like a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. And ultimately it comes back to, there are people who are going to have more physical prowess than others, and that's just how it is. But I also think that one of the most interesting conversations I've had, one of my closest friends was a high school wrestler. Mm-hmm. And he and I have discussed a lot how gender comes into play. He was assigned female at birth, so he wrestled with women when he wrestled in high school. And, you know, he was an, you know, incredible wrestler. But one of the conversations we had, and he said something to me that made it click for me so much, is he looks a lot at this. He analyzes a lot sports and how people are talking about gender in sports. But we also have to think about how we're socializing young people assigned female at birth and young people assigned male at birth, so young boys and young girls, how we're socializing them, and how often boys are given a lot more room to be physical, and, you know, women are not as much. So sometimes it may seem like men have a real advantage at sports. It's often because men have been given a lot more room to do that. And so I think that socialization comes into play so much in so many different ways and so many different things we think about. You know, women who often are given the ability to be as physical as, you know, young men are, you know, can be as talented easily as men often. And so I think we're going to see this changing a lot as we're moving into a space where women are able to, you know, we have women, young women trying out for football teams now, you know, things like that. So I think it's going to be interesting to see where this comes out and how this comes out. But sports, of course, are still really aggressively gendered in almost every area.
Yeah, that, I mean, not even bringing the T into the sports. Mm-hmm. I was just having a conversation, like, that's always been very divided. Like, that's mm-hmm. like people have been very protective, like, of sports that doesn't even need to really, could be very gender neutral. I think me and some friends were talking about bowling. Mm-hmm. Like, what advantage does a man right. have over a woman with bowling? Right. I mean, they maybe can throw the ball harder, but it's the way you throw the ball. But that's still broken up, and it comes back to like a locker room mentality. Right. So that is definitely going to be one of the. Well, I mean, you have a lot of uphill battles, but the sports is going to be the most probably degree because that's not even because that's still like cis women are still having that battle.
Absolutely. So cis women are still struggling to compete.
Yeah, and right. I mean, you got sports like, you know, Serena Williams could probably beat a lot of men.
Absolutely.
At tennis, you know, but I mean, I still feel like on the opposite side of that, for the most part, men are or I guess cis men are as a whole built different. Like, so I mean, that's the one thing I kind of see both. Would this be offensive, or would this be fair if someone had their identity match before puberty? Does puberty, like, would that make it fair? Would that make it more stressful? Or
so you're saying if they hadn't gone through, I'm just trying to understand your question. So if they hadn't gone through puberty, under, like, they'd had like pubertal suppression or some kind of like hormone blockers. Yeah. I mean, I think that obviously if somebody has gone through, so we'll say somebody who was assigned male at birth, and they were going to enter puberty with going through puberty under the influence of testosterone. If they're able to suppress that, which is best practice, I should say, for trans youth, if you're able to, if they were able to put in some kind of pubertal blockers, and then they didn't go through puberty under the influence of testosterone, I mean, I wouldn't think that you would see very many differences at all. But I also think that a lot of what we're talking about is just, we are going to have to move to a place, and I think we have a long way to go, but we're going to have to move to a place where we stop gendering things as much as we do ever. I think I love your example of bowling. I'm really going to think on that one, but I think it's something that we're often gendering things that don't need to be gendered. And in doing so, we're often, especially in physical things, giving men the advantage. People who are in the military know that men and women are divided there. There are probably women who could compete as often as the men.
Yeah, I mean,
but they're not even given the opportunity to. They're oftentimes doing push-ups like on their knees, and it's just very different.
And this is not all women. This is not all.
Oh, of course not.
But we're just talking percentages, like the men that are, because the people that's like in the NFL are not the typical men, because that's why they're in the NFL. So you're talking about you're talking about select groups of that like especially when you're thinking of gender roles. Someone who plays football is the epitome of a stereotypical male. It's like the man's man or whatever. Right. So, I don't know. I mean, I'm almost, I mean, I feel that you understand what I'm saying.
I do understand. I just think it's about degendering things, and a lot of it's about socialization. And an interesting side note, I don't know if it's a side note, but an interesting thing, I was looking at something last night where a woman went through a store and she photographed pictures of baby shirts for girls and baby shirts for boys. And it was really interesting to see. We know obviously colors, pink and blue, we know that happens, but even the messaging in the shirts, it was so interesting how, like, the girls, it was like the graphic t-shirts, they said things like sweetheart or whatever, and the boys were all very sports oriented. And so you think, like, that's happening to like from the time we're babies, young girls are being told, like, your job is to be sweet and gentle and quiet. And even when women say to me, and sometimes they do, well, no, but my parents weren't like that, it's still the messages we're getting in all of society. I mean, and that matters. That shapes who we are, that shapes who we become. And as a mother myself, I think about this a lot in terms of how I raise my own children. But that matters, and I think that when we get to a place where we're not gendering things so aggressively all the time, I think we'll see things change, and I think sports will be one of those things.
Yeah, I mean, because we touched on this last time, and when we're talking about how society, has been raised, like, you have the girls play with dolls. If you're a girl and you don't play with dolls, you're a tomboy. Right. Guys play with do these things, like, so the rewiring, I mean, it's probably not going to be people in our generation, because I would say people around our ages are in the in-between. Yeah. People that's older might be lost. Right. And it's the youth, that is going to be on them, because, and someone that reached out to me after the first one, talking about it normalizes it. Yeah. So I mean, I really think that's the first thing, is absolutely where it's not an awkward conversation. Right. Like when people are familiar with different terms, when people are familiar with not necessarily genderizing someone, not coming up to a table and saying, "Can I get you ladies anything?" Right. Exactly. Can I get y'all anything? Just you know what I mean.
Just taking gender. I think about how often we fill out forms and they say male or female, and they don't need to. And I always ask, like, if you can take that out and it still makes sense, take it out. You know, if any time in your language you can take gender out of something and it still works, just take it out. It's not necessary. And I think that's something we're going to have to move towards. And I also think it's important to note that our understanding, I mentioned this in the last episode as well, but our understanding of gender hasn't always been what it is now. This is, you know, and it will evolve. And I joke sometimes that I think my like great grandchildren will say things like, did you know that when, you know, great grandma was a girl, like they believed that there were only boys and girls? Like, I really think that's what we're moving towards as a society. I think we're really opening up and understanding that there are so many infinite combinations of what makes a person's identity.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, and I think another big hurdle or whatever is just separating identity and preference. That, you know, because I think for me, that was one of the hardest things to understand. Because when I remember the first, I think, this might have been before you were, you know, before you went to training and all this kind of stuff. But I don't know. I really don't. I can't really place it. But the first person that I knew that you know, transitioned, and then like and I was like, oh, this, you know, like I remember seeing their picture on Facebook, and it was like, you know, like, this is who I am now. It was like, okay. And I was just confused because this is someone that I worked with, and, you know, I knew them as who they were. And the first question, because I was totally ignorant, was, so were they gay?
Right.
And then, like, you know, someone talked to me, you know, my friend David Kenzel, I think, we were talking in a Port City Java. I mean, it was about something else, but me and David both worked with them. And he's like, no. And they were just talking about, you know, David does a lot better job of keeping up with people that we work with. So he knew the struggle that they had. Like, they moved back to Charlotte, and it was a rough time.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I was like, oh wow, you know, I had no idea. I mean, and probably when we worked together, this is when I worked at Best Buy, like, that wasn't even like a thing, really.
Right.
You know, like, that wasn't like, you know, like we talked about technology and just options. That wasn't an option. And I mean, it was just understanding, like, when someone, like, I have a friend who's gay, and, you know, that didn't matter. Like, they never really came out. And then when they finally came out and someone told me, oh, okay. Like, it's not someone that is like an effeminate male,
right?
But it's not someone that was like, you know. So I thought, oh, okay, and so I'm bringing up these two things just to show how different it is.
For
like,
sure.
You know, someone's sexual preference doesn't necessarily dictate them versus their orientation,
their gender identity.
Gender identity.
Yeah. So sexual orientation and gender identity have nothing to do with each other at all. And I think that that's something that's really challenging for a lot of people to wrap their head around. But they've done a number of studies in looking at this, and sexual orientation and gender identity are totally separate. I do think that it probably would be more common if somebody had been comfortable enough coming out as gay, and they navigated that space, that if they were also transgender, they might feel a little bit more, okay. So it goes back to like a causation correlation thing, right? So I think there have been a lot of studies done where they've said that there are more people who have autism who are transgender, who identify as transgender. And one of the things that they were looking at is like, is that true? Are these linked, or is this just that people with autism have already gotten used to navigating the world differently, and so they're more able to come out as transgender, you know? And I think it's similarly with sexual orientation. You know, if you've already navigated the world and you came out as a gay man, but you knew that you were actually a woman, and maybe you weren't able to articulate that, maybe you didn't know that yourself, but when you come to know that, then we've already navigated the world as a gay man. You've had one coming out. So I think that probably plays into it quite a bit as well. But I think that ultimately, you know, one of the biggest things that I always say in trainings or anywhere is we need to stop conflating sex and gender. The sexual orientation and gender, they're very different things. So,
but that's funny because the alphabets kind of relate to to both of those different things. Yep. So that almost adds to the confusion because, you know,
it does.
You know, And let's go over the alphabets one more time.
So L for lesbian.
Yeah.
So that's typically we think of that as being a woman who's attracted to other women.
A cisgender woman.
Or trans. I know transgender lesbians. I know lots of lots of transgender lesbians. But so typically lesbian is a term used by women. G for gay. And gay, historically, we thought of that as being men who are attracted to men. However, gay has been used by a lot of people can identify as gay. Typically, it just means they have same gender attraction. But it also, gay is also used as like a catch-all term often too. So some people will just say gay just as, meaning that they're not heterosexual or cisgender. Similarly, sort of like queer, which we'll talk about. B for bisexual. So bisexual means that they're attracted to people of the same gender or different genders. And we should talk about this in the next episode. I haven't even discussed non-binary identities or all the infinite possibilities there are around gender. But, spoiler alert, there are more than two genders. And so LGBT, of course, transgender we defined. So that's somebody who does not identify as the gender they were assigned at birth. And then sometimes you'll hear Q. Commonly you'll hear Q added onto that. And Q usually means, some people would say Q is questioning. I think more widely now we're knowing Q as queer, and queer has become, in some ways, queer is like this catch-all term. So queer can mean anything outside of cisgender and heterosexual. So somebody can, that's why I identify myself as queer. So while I do identify as cisgender, I know I'm not heterosexual. I don't necessarily. Sometimes I say I'm a lesbian, depends on, what context, or bisexual, or I've used a variety of different things, but queer just fits because it is so broad and means so many different things. It can mean so many different things.
Yeah, so in those letters, you got things that are identifying sexual preference.
Yeah.
But then you got trans that's identifying identity.
Right.
Then you also got with more kind of what you were just talking about, more in sexual preference, you got like pansexual.
Right.
What's some of the other like
pansexual, demisexual, asexual.
I see a lot of those on Plenty of Fish and OkCupid and Tinder.
Asexual people?
Well, they're just all those terminologies.
Oh, those terms, yeah. I think. Yeah, the alphabet's pretty lengthy, and that's kind of why I like queer, because queer just kind of sums it up as just something not, again, cisgender and heterosexual, but. And it's so funny because all of these things mean so many different things to so many people. Even a term that's been around as long as lesbian has. I mean, I think most of us, most people of our generation have. I don't remember a time. I kind of think I always knew lesbian, or at least from the time I was probably a teenager. I knew lesbian. But even that, if we had a panel right now and we invited 5 people to come up here and tell you how they identify as a lesbian, you might get 5 different answers, and that's again a more commonly agreed upon one. If you had 5 people come and tell you like how they define their asexuality or their demisexuality, or on and on, you get a lot of different answers. And so that goes back to what I said in the last episode, and something that I'm always trying to convey is that people don't have to know all this. It could be very, very complicated to know all of this. They just have to know how to not assume things about people, and then respect their identities.
Yeah, respect. I mean, I think that's one of the things that you just stressed is just be respectful.
Yep.
Like most people will be understanding.
Right.
And, not everybody, you got you got outliers in any demographic, whether big or small, but, especially if you're interested in learning or doing better, sounds like most people will accept, unless you're Michael Che, they will accept you, or Dave Chappelle, or the cancel culture. Well, we're going to talk about cancel culture hopefully soon.
Stay tuned, coming soon.
So one thing that you said earlier that I want to touch on before we go, people that are having trouble identifying, because I know we know people I know for a fact that people that had struggle to identify what they are. Mm-hmm. So what can you, I mean, I know it's kind of hard for you, or you might not even want to say it as a cis woman, but someone who is struggling or identifying, what tools do they have, or what can they find information, or like is there something that they would know, or
no? And this goes for not even just folks who are transgender, but a lot of people who might be queer in some form or fashion, to know that, first of all, there are, of course, a lot of resources out there. that people can turn to explore some of the more scholarly type resources, or genderspectrum.org is a great one, and one that I use a lot. But that's great for parents as well, for parents who have a child who just came out and they want more information. Genderspectrum.org is great. But also, I think it's important for people to know that all of this is a journey and a process and a spectrum and an evolution. And somebody who knew they were transgender at age 3 is no more valid than somebody who, realized they were transgender at 55. It is all just a process, and we all have different access to language, different ways to process how we feel about ourselves, different ways that we've been brought up, and socialization, and so many different things play a part in that. Internalized homophobia, internalized transphobia, those things are very real. I myself don't think I openly talked about being a queer woman until I was like well into my 30s. And in retrospect, I always knew that, but it wasn't something that I was ever comfortable talking about or exploring or sharing. And so I use myself as an example to say that, that doesn't make me less valid. It's taken me a long time to understand that doesn't make me less valid. But, and so rarely would anybody be truly alone in how they feel, and that's one of the biggest things that I always try to convey to particularly youth is, it may seem like it, but there's somebody else who has experienced what you've experienced, or can at least relate enough to, share and talk about it with you. So definitely finding a local LGBT center is important. LGBT centers often run youth programs or have resources, local resources. There's several hundred LGBT centers nationwide, actually worldwide. There are a lot, but nationwide I know. And knowing that there are great supports out there. And I want to drop one last thing. The Trevor Project is especially important for LGBTQ youth, and a good resource for people to share for LGBTQ youth who may be feeling having some kind of like emotional mental health needs or mental health crisis. So the Trevor Project has a chat line, like a text line, all kinds of things. So it's a great resource.
Okay. Yeah. One thing, like I consciously, at least for now, kind of kept the conversation away from like about kids, because that's the one thing a lot of people are touchy about.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to get them there. You know what I mean? Like some people will automatically shut down kind of with that. But I think a lot of that also goes with the conversation of sexual identity or sexual preference versus identity. Because people,
right.
like, because that's, I mean, we've been wired a certain way, which, I always bring up, well, I mean, people were wired to think people can be indentured servants to other people.
Exactly.
And that was a normal.
Exactly.
So, any last words or anything else that you want to say, any information that you want to give out on any of these things?
Well, I really want to encourage people to continue to have these conversations and continue to ask questions. And I really want to encourage people to, if they're able to, or if they have a space where they can, to let people know that they are LGBTQ affirming. So when I mentioned the Trevor Project, even putting up a resource like that in a space where, if you work at a church, or, if you spend time at like a church or a facility where there are teenagers, having something like that available can really be a life-saving measure for young people. So as we continue to have these conversations, it's also important to figure out ways that we can let people know that we are, even if you don't have all the answers, that you're open and willing to have those conversations. You're open and willing to be a safe space for somebody.
Okay. And any like social media, where can people like either find you or your organization? I know you're based out of Raleigh, but there's some I'm sure there's some like national stuff that people can find it, or just however people want to find you or anything. What social medias do you have that you want to give out?
Definitely. So we're LGBT Center of Raleigh, lgbtcenterofraleigh.com online, but they can also look at the center link. If you look up Centerlink LGBT centers, that gives you a list of all the LGBT centers in the world who are Centerlink participants. So that's how people can find their local center.
Okay. And you can find me on find me on YouTube if you're not watching this on YouTube. IMoLTPodcast. Also IMoLTPodcast on Instagram. Inquisitive Mind of Lewis T on Facebook. Make sure you share, like, subscribe. If you want to, you can also email me at mindoflewist@gmail.com. If you want to be on the show, be a sponsor, topics, all that kind of good stuff. And make sure you comment. You know, you don't always have to just hit me directly. There's a comment section. You can have these comments and start the conversation. Lindsey, thank you for coming back.
Thanks, Lughes.
Hopefully we can have you back again, and make sure you watch that Chappelle show.
I will.
And talk to other people, and because I really want to get, because a lot of time media spins things. I want to know if this is a media spin or is this like real concerns.
Yeah. Okay. We'll talk about that.
All right, and just thank y'all. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Yeah.